Rome, the Eternal City. It has stood in peaceful security for nearly 800 years. And while the actual capital of the empire was moved to Ravenna, Rome still stands as the spiritual center of the empire. Night has fallen on the city, and a chill September wind blows through the window of your fine and spacious apartment. The sounds of Roman nightlife and the smells of evening meals buffet your home and provide a pleasant and reassuring backdrop to your evening. It was a long day in the Senate because for the second time in as many years, the Goths are outside the gates of Rome. These barbarians, who seem completely incapable of building anything, or even feeding themselves for that matter, are once again trying to extort gold and food from the empire. The day's arguments reverberate in your mind. Should we pay? How much? Can't the army just disperse them? And so the Senate retired with nothing resolved. As you enjoy your wine, you begin to feel uneasy. The smells of food have been replaced by smoke, and you can hear ominous sounds in the distance. As the rumbling gets closer, you can hear the unmistakable sounds of panic, terror, and battle coming from outside. You sit in stunned silence. What on earth is happening outside? Where are the soldiers? Whatever it is that's happening, surely you, the senator, would be safe. Right? Welcome to Rogue Records, where we invite you to sit back, relax, and hear the true tale of history's barbarian king. The Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia. They began pushing westward into modern-day Europe in the 4th century AD, conquering lands and peoples as they went. They were feared and coordinated warriors who laid waste to the poorly organized armies before them. It was 372 AD when the Huns began their major push west, conquering the Greuthungi Goths in what is now modern-day Ukraine. Their attacks were swift and vicious, burning and pillaging all that stood in their way. Relative ease of conquering the Greuthungi Goths empowered the Huns to continue expanding westward, and next they invaded the lands of Tervingi and Typhus, the home of the Visigoth people. The Visigoths had already seen what happened to their Greuthungi cousins, and many of them fled the Hun onslaught, abandoning their farms and homes to seek refuge and safety in the world's greatest empire. So the Visigoths fled into Roman territory, where they knew the Huns would not follow them, and they petitioned the Emperor Valens for sanctuary. Their petition was accepted, and the Romans sent the refugees to the area around the Danube River in what is now modern-day Bulgaria. The Emperor Valens saw these refugees as a source of cheap labor and conscripts to fill out Rome's martial forces, as by this time actual Roman citizens saw military service as largely beneath them. The refugees were happy to be alive and to receive Roman aid, which primarily meant food, as the Visigoths had fled their farms with little food, and the area that they settled in was largely undeveloped from an agricultural standpoint. However, the food provided by the Romans quickly ran out, for two major reasons. Firstly, the Roman food stores in the region had not been planned with a massive influx of mouths to feed in mind, and so what was there was simply not adequate for the Visigoths. Secondly, with a food shortage in the area, the economic principle of supply and demand sent the price of food skyrocketing. And when that happened, unscrupulous Roman officers would commandeer the supplies and sell them off to line their own pockets. This left the Visigoths with little food and even fewer options. While it is true that part of the settlement agreement with Rome was that the children of Visigoth leaders would be taken and educated, ostensibly to acculturate them, but really they were hostages. The famine and high food costs made this a common reality for most Goths. So children, or other family members, were sold into Roman slavery, so that the rest of the family could afford to buy food to stay alive. Unsurprisingly, this created a growing animosity between the Visigoths and the Romans. The Visigoths' gratitude at being protected from the Huns soon turned to anger over family separation and Roman corruption. With so many people in such dire straits, all it would take is a single spark to ignite the powder keg. And it was a skirmish in the Roman markets of the city of Marcianople, where Roman soldiers refused to allow the Visigoths to buy food, that lit the fuse and started the Gothic War. The pivotal battle of this war occurred in 378 in the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey, where the Visigoths not only routed the Roman army, but actually killed the Emperor Valens. And while this didn't end the war, it did serve as a rallying point for the Goths. And it proved to the Romans that these barbarians would not be conquered so easily. With the emperor dead and the Roman army disgraced by that loss, Rome needed a new emperor, one that could quell the Goth uprising without destroying the empire. They would need someone that was courageous, but also pragmatic, who knew when to fight and when to negotiate. So a council of Roman officials raised a man to emperor who they felt fit this criteria. Theodosius I was raised to the throne of Eastern Roman Emperor on January 19, 379. He came from a noble family, and his father, also named Theodosius, had been a high-ranking Roman general. Theodosius had learned strategy and tactics from his father, and had a successful history as a military commander repelling and subjugating invading barbarians, in particular the Samaritan invasion in 374. Given this pedigree and military experience, he seemed a good choice to meet this moment in the empire's history. But after 3 years of conflict, the Romans could not defeat or expel the Visigoths from Roman territory. And so an accord was reached instead. The Visigoths would settle south of the Danube permanently and be a Roman territory, thus affording them Rome's protection against non-Roman aggressors, like, say, the Huns. This was a normal part of Roman incorporation. However, the other parts of the agreement were very unusual for Rome. For one, the Visigoths were allowed to be largely autonomous, with their own leadership structure rather than having a Roman governor. And perhaps even stranger, they were not disarmed, and continued to have their own forces and train their own warriors. In exchange for the Roman aid, the Goths agreed to marshal troops on Rome's behalf to help, quote, defend the empire. It was around this time, in 382, that a young Visigoth noble named Alaric was growing up, surrounded by soldiers that had spent the last 6 years in nearly continuous battle. He was trained in the ways of war, but was also raised as a Roman, and would come to covet Rome's approval. 10 years of relative peace would pass before Goth military reserves would be called up by Theodosius to deal with an internal Roman power struggle. You see, there was a usurper to the throne of the Western Roman Empire named Eugenius. While the usurper was himself a Christian, he cynically exploited the anger of the traditional Roman religions against Theodosius, who had been outlawing pagan practices.
I have restored the temple of Venus to honor our empire's great traditions. We shall never be forced to abandon the gods whose blessings have built the very foundations of our society. Christ has joined the great pantheon of the gods, not replaced it.
The turning point of this conflict occurred in 394 at the Battle of Frigidus, or the Frigid River. where Eugenius and his army clashed with the Visigoths. The Goths attacked savagely and tore into the usurper's forces, crushing position after position, while the Roman forces loyal to Theodosius, well, they just kind of stood there and watched. For the Romans, this was a two birds, one stone kind of scenario. They would use their frenemies, the Goths, to destroy their enemies, resulting in a Visigoth nation that was weaker and less able to refuse the orders of Rome. It was only after the Visigoths had inflicted massive casualties on rebel forces and themselves suffered great losses that the Roman forces of the emperor came in and mopped up the last of the rebels, capturing Eugenius, who was summarily executed, ending the rebellion. The Goths were expecting to receive commendations, praise, and perhaps the citizenship that they had been denied up to this point. But the Roman general Stilicho simply ordered them from the field and back to their homes, leaving the Goths, and in particular Alaric, who had been a captain over the Goth soldiers, extremely angry. And while the Goths marched home angry at their ill treatment, a new crisis was unfolding that would further degrade their relations with Rome. Theodosius, emperor of the unified Roman Empire, died of an illness, leaving behind two inexperienced and spoiled sons, Honorius and Arcadius. The empire was once again split into the Western Empire under Honorius and the Eastern Empire under Arcadius, leading to ongoing feuds between the two brothers that would further weaken the empire. This turn of events meant two things to Alaric and the Visigoths. Number one, the promises of Theodosius were now as dead as he was, and they could not expect either of his sons to care about their people's interests. Secondly, it meant that the two young emperors would be so busy fighting each other that they wouldn't be able to marshal forces against Alaric, and the Visigoths could basically do whatever they wanted. So, Alaric decided to take this opportunity for the Visigoth people to forge their own path out of poverty and hunger without having to rely on the Romans.
Our agreement and settlement was granted by Theodosius more than 10 years ago. And what has it gotten us? The Romans call us barbarians and consider our land a backwater not worth spending time on. Now Theodosius himself is dead, and what worth his agreements had are gone now. Will we wait and hope for his spoiled sons to care more about us than he did? No, says I. No more waiting on Roman promises. No more hoping our crops won't fail and then begging Rome for food when they do. I say we shall seek a kingdom by our own exertions and built on our own power, rather than serve others in idleness as slaves.
The Visigoths wholeheartedly agreed with Alaric's plans and elevated him to be their king, leading them into glory and prosperity, or so they hoped. But while Alaric fully intended to put his people first, there was still a part of him that wanted to be recognized by Rome. To Alaric, the path to glory and prosperity basically meant conquest and plunder. He had been trained as a soldier pretty much his whole life after all, so it was what he knew. The Visigoths began marching south, away from the area where the two pubescent emperors were duking it out, and into the rich areas of Thrace, on their way to their primary target, Athens. The Visigoths rolled over the Athenians, destroying the great temples of Greece and setting the city ablaze, while the people of Athens could only watch as their beloved city was plundered. And plunder they did. The Goths took everything of value that they could find in the city. Jewelry, precious metals like gold and silver, weapons, armor, even great works of art were all fair game to the Visigoths. But that wasn't all they took. Equally important to the Goth people was food. So stores of produce and grains were also taken to feed both the army and their people back home, because for some reason the Goths seemed incapable of growing enough food on their own. Word had reached Arcadius of the Goths' rampage through the empire, and he knew he needed to do something about Alaric and his army. But he had one big obstacle stopping him. And that obstacle was the general Stilicho, who led the armies and served as chief advisor to the Western Roman Emperor, Arcadius's brother, Honorius. Stilicho had a reputation as both an excellent strategist and a brilliant battlefield tactician. If Arcadius diverted his attention to Alaric, Stilicho might very well move against him and hand a unified empire to Honorius, leaving Arcadius under house arrest, or worse. But Stilicho is a name you should remember. He had been the commander at the Battle of Frigidus that had so cavalierly sacrificed the Visigoths while keeping his own forces back, thus making him someone the Goths, and Alaric, despised. It was Arcadius's advisor, a man named Eutropius, who suggested that they leverage this animosity by declaring Stilicho an enemy of the empire, and providing official titles and support to Alaric. This would serve as a shield against Honorius's designs on the unified throne, while simultaneously preventing the Visigoths from continuing to ravage Arcadius's eastern empire, by redirecting them from conquest to revenge. So Alaric was named Magister Militum per Illyricum, elevating him to a military position second only to the emperor himself. This delighted Alaric, as it felt like the commendations and glory that the Goths had been denied by Stilicho at Frigidus had finally been received. It also meant that he could provision food and weapons and armor from Roman stores as he saw fit, and the Goths returned to their own lands sated, at least for now. However, this peace would not last, as Eutropius, the advisor that had suggested Alaric elevation in the first place, turns out he was a greedy and conniving, and he alienated many key figures in Arcadius' court. And so, he was stripped of rank and then executed in 399. The new advisor, the Empress Eudoxia, had no great love for the Goths and had Alaric and the Visigoths' domain moved closer to the border with the Western Empire, increasing the Goths' negative exposure to Stilicho. And then she had Alaric stripped of his titles. The idea was that this would keep the Visigoths as a bulwark against the West without having to recognize some barbarian as their equal. This new state of affairs left King Alaric unsure how to proceed. So he did what many Romans did back then. He sought to consult an oracle. So he searched out a sacred grove, ate some funny mushrooms, and looked for the oracle. And he would find her, deep in the grove. And as he approached, she spoke to him.
Alaric, king of the Goths, take your men west into Italia. You shall penetrate the city.
And so, bolstered by the oracle's prophecy, Alaric led his army into northern Italy in 402 AD. He conquered and plundered at will, until he finally faced Stilicho at Pollentia, where he was quickly defeated in a rout so complete that Alaric's wife and children were captured by the Romans as hostages. They retreated from their crushing defeat and were pursued by Stilicho all the way to Verona. The battle at Verona was also officially won by Stilicho, but most historians suspect this was actually a standoff that Stilicho won by negotiation, given that he returned Alaric's family and allowed him and all his men to return unmolested to their own lands outside of Italy. Had Stilicho really decisively beat Alaric at Verona, he would have simply finished him off, which is something he really needed to do, because once Alaric's men marched home, Stilicho had to deal with another group of Goths, under a man named Radagaisus, that invaded Italy soon after. And for the next few years, Stilicho would deal with barbarian invasion after barbarian invasion. And in 407 AD, Alaric invaded again. But with the army stretched so thin on so many fronts, Stilicho could not hold them off by force of arms, which only left bribery. Stilicho paid off Alaric to return home with a princely sum of 4,000 pounds of gold. And while this ended the Visigoth invasion without additional bloodshed, it sealed Stilicho's fate as a leader of the empire. You see, there was another man in the Western court that coveted Stilicho's long-standing position as Honorius's most trusted advisor. His name was Olympus, and he saw this latest deal with Alaric as his chance to finally gain the emperor's ear.
These Goths have been a plague upon the empire for decades now, stealing food and gold from the very empire that has provided for and protected them. Now our so-called great general, Stilicho, has not only failed to deal with the Goths in the north, but has just handed over a king's ransom to these eastern Goths without even a single battle. Either he is incompetent or, more likely, he's in league with these barbarians. The biggest enemy and greatest threat to the empire is Stilicho himself and his allies, the Goths.
So Olympus had Stilicho declared an enemy of the empire and bribed some of his own men to betray him. But that wasn't enough, and Olympus went from underhanded to downright stupid. You see, he decided it was also time to purge all Goth soldiers from the army, and not just the soldiers, but the Goth villages with the troops' families were also purged. The rather predictable result of having the Roman army turn on the Goths within it was that the Goths left the army en masse, along with their families, those that were, still alive anyway, and joined Alaric, swelling his forces to over 30,000. To complete the stupidity trifecta, Olympus then had the emperor refuse Alaric's rather modest request for a much smaller sum of gold and the official title of Comes, or Count, as the title would come to be known in latter days. Alaric led his newly swole army to the gates of Rome and sieged the city, allowing no food or other goods to be taken inside. The starving citizens and politicians of Rome quickly made concessions to Alaric, including but not limited to 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and the title of head of the Roman army. He also left the city with an additional 40,000 Goth slaves that were also freed as part of the agreement, further increasing his army. It should be noted that this was way more than he had asked of Olympus and been refused. But rather than let that be the end of it, Emperor Honorius, couldn't let this humiliation go. So he rescinded Alaric's titles.
After all, why should a barbarian who only obtained the title through thuggery and extortion be allowed to keep it? I am the emperor of the most powerful empire in the history of the world. I won't deign to give this barbarian such honors given his treachery.
And while those in his court cheered his nobility and courage, they really shouldn't have. If there is one thing they should have learned about Alaric by now, it's that he loves his title and military honors even more than the plunder he receives. And the dishonor of having his title stripped from him was the one sure way to enrage him. And so Alaric and the Goths marched on Rome for a second and final time. In 410 AD, the Visigoths sacked Rome. They had been let into the city by some Visigoth slaves that had sabotaged the city gates, allowing Alaric easy access to the city. They pillaged for days, and there was only one place of refuge for the Romans: Christian churches. These were held as off-limits by Alaric, and so many Romans sought refuge in these houses of worship. Those that didn't were killed or taken as slaves. All told, the Goths killed 12,000 Romans, roughly 20% of Rome's population at that time, and took thousands more as slaves. The Western Roman Empire never recovered from this loss, and would collapse completely a little more than 50 years later. If you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, and comment down below. I promise to get back to you as soon as I can.